With that, I would like to turn it over to our esteemed council president, joining us here tonight to talk about the tree preservation ordinance, and I'll hand it right over.
Thanks so much, Maggie, and thank you all. I just want to start by saying a huge thank you to you. I started my public service life on my district council board, Westside Community Organization. I know that you all have a lot of other things you could be doing with your Wednesday evenings, and you're here, some of you in person, some on Zoom, but regardless, just thank you. I know it's often thankless work, and I really, really appreciate the time you put in. Um, I am here tonight. Actually, my legislative aide, Megan Jeckett, is here with me as well. She dropped off of the Zoom, but she's right here to speak to you a bit about this tree preservation ordinance that we've been working on. I mentioned Megan because she's been doing the lion's share of the work on a really complicated policy. And we just came out of a pretty long council meeting. So we're both a little bit brain dead. So we thought if we put our brains together, you would have a full brain telling you about this. But essentially what we're trying to do is address something that we know is a citywide issue that we've heard from people all across the city, not just Ward 2, that trees are important. They're important for all the reasons. They don't tell you why they're important, from an environmental perspective, from an urban heat island perspective, from just a aesthetic perspective, property values, and even just a personal connection. We all know what it feels like when a tree in our neighborhood that we're used to seeing, a tree on our boulevard, a tree outside our home, has to get taken down, for example, during Emerald Ash Borer and other times. And it's painful. It feels like it's personal. And so the sort of care and concern for trees that we've been seeing all across the city really spurred me to take a closer look at what our ordinances say and don't say about tree preservation. And this actually happened, the impetus for this was walking down the street in downtown St. Paul, right outside town, the city hall where I work, and seeing that when we put in the Wabasha leg of the Capital City Bikeway, we had taken out a block of trees between 4th and 5th Street along Wabasha. And I saw that there weren't trees anymore where I was used to seeing them. I called our public works director. I said, "Oh, when are the trees going back in after the bikeway's done?" And he said, "Oh, they're not going back in. There wasn't room for them." And obviously there have been many high profile instances of this concern in many streets across our city. And so when I started looking at it, it became apparent that while we had some tree preservation requirements in place, they weren't sufficient. And in particular, they weren't clear enough that tree preservation needs to be thought of much earlier in the process, that it isn't sort of once the project is 90% engineered and designed, you have to present your tree plan and oops, if it doesn't work at 90%, then I guess you can't keep the trees. So a much earlier consideration for trees. And we also didn't have any requirements that trees be preserved in place, or that they be replanted in place, or that they be replanted elsewhere if they couldn't be replanted in place. So sort of this no net loss of trees in the city was what I was trying to get at, and we didn't have that in place. So we embarked on creating this ordinance, and it's really an ordinance. It's called an administrative ordinance, which is a kind of law that directs our city staff to do things a certain way. So unlike a law that directs the public, like you have to pay a minimum wage or you have to go the speed limit, this is really for our public works and our parks staff, telling them how to conduct work when they are doing construction or maintenance on city-owned right-of-way. So that's our streets, that's our trails, that's our sidewalks in particular. We're also hoping, even though we can't specifically direct other public entities like the county or the state, MnDOT, for example, we can't necessarily tell them what to do when they're doing construction or maintenance on their own streets that go through the city of St. Paul, but we do know that they look to our guidelines and will reference them. You may have had folks from those departments, those agencies come and talk to you and say, yeah, we're trying to keep to the city of St. Paul's, sidewalk plan or road diet requirements, things like that. So we know that by having that policy in place, those entities will also be more likely to follow it. So we had a proposed ordinance way back in February. We heard feedback at the time that there was a lot more public engagement that was needed. People really wanted the chance to weigh in more deeply on something that affects, again, so many people in so many parts of our city. So we took a step back. We said, our city's been around since 1849. We haven't had a tree preservation ordinance all that time. We can take another few months without one to get this right. And so again, huge credit to Jeckett. She pulled together this, what we've called our public input group. Lovingly, we refer to it as our pig. Everyone in St. Paul loves pigs, it's like our mascot. So, and that public input group has been meeting throughout the summer, 5 times between May and mid-August, and is now continuing to meet again as we get closer to an actual ordinance draft. It's been folks from all across the city, different neighborhood associations, nonprofit groups, people with different levels of expertise in forestry, tree management, things like that. And they've been talking about sort of what should this ordinance do? What should it achieve? And you have in front of you the work product that they produced. I'm not going to read it to you. I know you can do that on your own, but essentially they had a few buckets of recommendations for what the ordinance would be like. First of all, they wanted it to be very clear and very enforceable. So don't write something that is vague. Make it clear to everyone what's expected, and that's the way to make it binding. That way you remove any ambiguity. Plan early and inclusively. So again, it's not that trees necessarily trump anything else. Obviously, sidewalk width and accessibility and bike lanes and the street itself are all very important, but give trees, elevate trees to the level that equitable status that they should have by planning early, and letting the tree planning shape the project design, not just be an afterthought. Transparency and accountability, having really clear notification, timelines, follow through. Equity, so if trees need to be taken out, thinking about replanting them somewhere that is underpopulated so that we preserve and expand our canopy, but do it in a way that is protecting all of us equally from the urban heat island. And then finally, this has come up actually on the public input group, and as we've been presenting to district councils again and again, this question about, it's not just about planting the trees, but stewarding them over time. There's nothing worse than seeing a brand new baby tree come in, not knowing, not seeing it get watered, seeing it fail to thrive, or even not understanding what's your responsibility as a property owner with a boulevard tree compared to what the city is going to take on. And not just in the first year, but over time. And again, the goal is to really emphasize protecting trees on city-owned land, so boulevards, right-of-way, parks, trails, maybe in the future expand to private property, but that is not being touched by this ordinance yet. So that group submitted the report that you see with all of those sort of overall guidelines. We have a consultant who's been working with Parks and Public Works to draft the ordinance. We expect to have a draft ready-ish by the end of the year. That will go to the Parks Commission and then come to the City Council. But one of the things that we also want to have at the same time as the ordinance is something called standard operating procedures. So often we'll pass an ordinance that's high level, and then later on we'll pass the rules that really get into the details of how it's going to be enforced. So for example, it's one thing to say replant a tree, but if you're replanting a tree this big from a tree that was this big, is that a 1-for-1? And that's the kind of detail that is often gotten into in the rules, the standard operating procedures, rather than at the ordinance level. The public input group really felt strongly that they didn't want the ordinance to be sort of to have a wolf in sheep's clothing situation, right? Where the ordinance looks good, but then the rules come along later and are not good. So what we're trying to do is both adopt the rules and the ordinance at the same time. The rules might take a little bit longer, so we're looking at a June effect date, so probably adopting it sometime in late May, early June, and then having everything take effect at the end of June. But it's been worth the time we've been putting in, not only because it's given us time to get more input, but because we're really directing the departments as to how to work together. And so a bit of this has been, the process has been the outcome. The fact that we've had Parks and Public Works staff working together with community on this ordinance, we think is going to give us a better chance of making sure that those departments actually continue to work together once the ordinance is in place, once we need them to take action. So all of that said, we wanted to come to you tonight to share the work that's happened so far and to get your input just high level. If you've had a chance to read the document that we sent over, awesome, but we didn't expect that. We welcome your input anytime, but just generally, when you think about trees in your neighborhood or the city's approach to trees, what's working, what's not working? From a communication standpoint, what would you like to see that you're not seeing? All of this feedback is really helpful as we draft the ordinance. And then, of course, we will also have a formal, public hearing, and we'll be sending the ordinance out once it's done for more feedback. But this is just kind of looking for feedback even earlier than that. So with that, I will stop my monologue. I will look to Jecca to see if I got anything horribly wrong, but I'm getting 2 thumbs up. Okay, good. And I'd love to hear your thoughts.
All right, folks. So that turns it over to the floor in the streetcar station. So we'll open it up for questions.
And we're taking notes. So
the sort of the fiasco that I'm most familiar with in District 12 along Cleveland Avenue, that was a real kerfluffle with the new trail and the fir oaks and put in younger trees. I'm just curious, how how would this change something? Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, it's a little bit faint, but now I can.
Okay.
When you're speaking.
So I was talking about the District 12 Cleveland Avenue.
Yep.
How would this change something like that? Do you have sort of some examples of, would the St. Anthony Park folks, would they have gotten a little more input earlier on in the process, or that's kind of a case study? Like, how would this have changed something like that? We also had one pretty close by, just northeast of the lake. So what would be different under this type of ordinance?
I'll answer half and I'll let Jecka answer another. Oh, she's right here. There we go. So first of all, Cleveland being a county road, this kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about how we can't direct those other entities, but we can have policies that they are inclined to refer to and that we can put pressure on them to refer to, and frankly, that you can put pressure on them, right? So if we haven't codified something in ordinance, then we can't really say, it's like with your kids, if you haven't set the rule, you can't really expect them to follow it. So being really clear about what we expect when it comes to trees will help us put pressure on those other entities. I think with Cleveland, the biggest change would be, I'll let Jacket speak about notification if there's more that I'm not aware of, but that design, having at the much earlier stages of engineering and design for that roadway, having a tree preservation plan would probably have affected the number of trees that eventually needed to come out. So that's a huge part of it. What else would you say?
That we had our big meeting on Monday, that all trees will be protected. Well, all trees will be covered by the tree preservation ordinance. So we're working with Public Works and Parks to design a resident-friendly flow chart for this ordinance so that the constituents are better able to understand how a project, the scale of a project, then relates to the tree being preserved, protected, hopefully not removed. So I mean, that's the biggest difference I would say could be made, because I followed that pretty closely when it happened on Cleveland, of just how sudden and taken aback folks were. So what we're trying to do under this ordinance is having people literally have a roadmap of how a tree would be affected. So that when a public works project and a tree go head to head, the tree has a fighting chance. Because right now because there is no ordinance, there is no protection.
Thanks for the great question. I see, I don't know, Maggie, if you want me to call on people. I see Christy's hand. Okay.
Hi, I read through all the proposed ordinance a bit ago, so I've kind of forgotten. I was trying to review it, but I live where all the construction on the east side of Como is happening right now, and I've been like super big advocate for my 5 trees on my boulevard after they cut down, I don't know how many trees, but it was many, many, many trees on like Parkview and Lakeview and everywhere. And in June, I talked to the project manager and she was like, we're not cutting any more trees down. Like those, like the ones we did. And then as the projects progress, they're like, we may cut your trees down. Like they might need to, like, it seems like it's being led. It's up to the road crew. Like, and I'm like, I don't think these guys are experts. I mean, like in road stuff, but like, I don't want them deciding what to do with my trees. And my trees have suffered a lot of damage. They were like bashed them with backhoe and ripped branches off. And I was calling the city, and then I'd see someone run over and talk to the backhoe guy, and I'd like hide because I was like, oh, they're probably going to be like, she's the crazy old woman who's like yelling. But I feel like I'm really, I feel like once the decisions have been made, like I like the part in your, I can't get it up on my screen now, that says something about, it was something to the effect of once the decisions are made, they're made in the beginning about the tree. We're not like as we go. And I get it that like sometimes things have to change, but yeah, it felt like they took down far too many trees in this situation, and it felt like it happened really fast and there was no input. They just marked them and took them down, and the neighborhood had like I think it, well, in Parkview or Lakeview, they got a temporary restraining order. Like, it was like
Mhm.
people were having to like really go into panic mode. And every
Mhm.
day I go out and I'm like, I wonder if my trees will still be there. Like,
Right.
they've cut between the curb and my sidewalk, which they've dug up both. There's probably like 2 feet of space on either side of my crabapple trees with the roots just
Mhm.
sticking out of the ground. I'm like, they don't care. Like these, I
Mhm.
mean, that's not their job. The like guys who with the big equipment, that's not their job. But there's been no
Right.
protection added. And so
Yeah.
I was curious, two things. One is, does this add protection for the trees? Like when there's construction, like, I wanted to see like
Mm.
barricades around the trees, like don't come
Mhm.
closer than this. Like you don't need to. Um, the other thing is like I've kind of heard like here and there on like social media, which I know is completely not the place to get information about anything, and yet I do. Um, that this is partially about the Save Our Streets and the bike lane,
Mm.
like kind of trying to head off. People throw the NIMBY, turn them around, which I hate because
Mhm.
that like everybody would want, everybody wants what's best for their neighborhood. But so I was like, is this a tool being used as a tool to stop that bike lane progress that I know is really cause like that's huge kind of tenuous issue on Summit.
Yeah. Well, I'll take first of all, I hear you loud and clear about, it sounds like you're saying, I want to be notified in advance of what the impact is going to be to trees. I want that notification to be from someone who's knowledgeable, not the guy who's running the backhoe. And not in the midst of the project, but early on. And then I think something else I would just add is that even if a tree does have to be impacted, what I feel strongly about is that then this ordinance ensures that that tree is replanted. So the overall canopy, no one wants to lose a tree outside their home, but at least the knowledge that that is going to be replanted somewhere else, if not in place, I think is a whole lot better than what we have now, which is they could just be gone. To your questions, I started with the origin of this ordinance in part to kind of counter some of that, what we've been hearing about this is all just an SOS plot to whatever. I've been very vocal about my support for the Summit Avenue bike lane. I've taken a lot of heat for that. So this is far from an attempt to derail that. Again, it did come from this realization actually downtown, but it is also true that trees and bikeways and sidewalks and streets often do have conflict, and trees matter a lot. So the goal here is not to prevent construction or redevelopment or bikeways from happening. It's to be very clear about how we prioritize trees amongst all of those other competing alternatives. Sometimes they're going to lose out, at least in that location. But rather than just sort of leaving that open to interpretation as to how we're going to prioritize those different things, really making it clear and having a public conversation about it. How do we want to prioritize trees? In fact, I think if we'd had that before the Summit Avenue Regional Trail was proposed, we could have avoided perhaps, I don't know, a lot of the tension and the pain that has come out of that conversation. And in fact, I hoped to introduce this quite a while ago, but because we were in the midst of being sued by SOS, we couldn't introduce it at the time because it would look like we were just trying to do something to get out of the lawsuit, even though it had come from a different source. So I had to wait until that, we're in another lawsuit now, but the first lawsuit had wrapped up before we could introduce this one. That said, we have folks from SARPA and SOS on the public input group, along with people who are very much in favor of the bikeway, in part to try to get all the voices in one room trying to work on this ordinance. I'm going to let Jack could answer the questions about protection during construction if you have an answer for that.
Yep, I do. Yeah, and I always say as the person who's been facilitating all of these meetings, like if it weren't a complex issue, it wouldn't be a municipal issue. Like working in local government, we don't have the luxury to pretend that there's not folks that are in opposition on different issues because at the end of the day, like we all live so close and these issues intersect different neighborhoods and different projects. Like this bike trail just happens to be the controversial issue of the moment. But as we've been visiting these district councils, every neighborhood has their equivalent of that trail. So, our office is being just aware of reality of different St. Paulites with different decisions, their different opinions and different projects. So just carrying on to that as the facilitator of the group. In terms of protections, I'm pulling these from our most recent meeting, Tuesday evening, where we were able to sit down with Public Works and get some answers on protections. So right now, I don't know and I put this in my follow-up to them, if trees are, we have protections for if public infrastructure is damaged by contractors. I am unclear if we consider trees to be part of public infrastructure, but under this ordinance, trees would be considered public infrastructure. So if contractors would be liable for damage to trees, penalties will apply directly to the contractors, not the project budget. So if you damage a tree, it's not the project, we don't budget damage. You as the contractor will have to pay. We asked a lot about our PIG asked a lot about subcontractors. Those will be the responsibility of the main contractor. And then we also posed the questions, can contracts specify required tree protections provisions instead of it having be something in the standard operating procedures, just have that baked into the contract. You also asked about protections during construction. I give the example of the construction right now at Hidden River, at least as of the last time I ran by, which has been a couple weeks, but they just have snow fencing wrapped around the trees, which is super symbolic because as we've learned through this project about drip zones and critical root area, under this ordinance, the critical root zone would now be defined by diameter at 4.5 feet height. And we also wouldn't be specifically saying that area is protected if it's soil, but it would be defined as like general area. So if it's concrete, if it's sidewalk, if it is more of a hard material. So all that is to say, we're just now getting to the specifics of what that protection looks like, but yes, it'll absolutely be there. And then we're also planning to have more of our city's arborists be involved in the process and to tap into their expertise of if a project is underway, making sure that they have signed off and agreed that the protection practices are in place. And we've also talked about what does compliance look like, which is almost like an audit or just like we have inspectors show up, what is that role for forestry as well? So that if a forester walks upon a construction site and you've got a truck parked over that critical root zone, that's a fine. You have now violated the ordinance.
Thanks, Rebecca. So as you can see, we could talk about this all day. I also just want to be respectful of the fact that we're your guests. So Maggie, like cut us off whenever we're on your time. Just tell us how much time we got. So, and Christy, I see your hand again too.
Oh, I just wanted to say thank you for addressing. I was going to ask about the arborists because I believe it's their job to be the ones marking the trees. I know they walked through the Como neighborhood, and also that like when I've contacted the city inspector, the project inspector or the project manager, they've never said call the arborist. They just are like, oh, we'll come over and look. But I also just feel like there should be something strong in place for all the different people being subcontracted from the city, because I mean, they're here to do their job, and they're like, we're gonna get this road done. I don't care if I break down their crabapple tree. It's just a crabapple tree. Like,
right.
So, I want, like St. Paul's trees are what make it so beautiful, the streets and the canopy. And I'm sure they think, oh, we can just dig them up and replant them. But like, then you get a tiny little tree. And like, I've got a, 35 or 40 foot catalpa that I, they're like, they came out and chopped a bunch of branches off. They gave me like 2 hours warning. And I was like, like I've actually, and they're really friendly guys. Like I've gone out and like joked that I'm going to chain myself to the trees, and they're like, okay, then we won't do the work. But I'm like, but I really don't want to have to do that. Like,
right.
So, and I'm also glad to see that there's some bike lane proponents on the committee that was working on this, because I think it's something like this is going to bring out all sides. And I think it's like an important to balance, there's definitely work that has to be done, but like, we need to save the trees, I'm like,
Thank you, Christy. I really appreciate it. I see Dan's hand up, and maybe Shevik's also.
Yeah, actually, Shevik was raising a hand for me. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, cool. I have a loud voice, but I figured. So I heard that Rebecca was going to be here, so I figured I better read the darn thing and have some comments. She'll be disappointed. So anyway, I have a few comments. They're mostly comments, not questions, but I'll try to be brief with them generally. So as Shevik knows, I can't do that. The protection during construction, you've already talked about. I just want to. That was one of my notes, but I agree with that. I'll say ditto. Other than one comment, you mentioned the city arborist, maybe if there's some way to write in some sort of authority, you know, similar to maybe like what a construction inspector has, like, I think of the Lorex, who will speak for the trees? You need to have someone actually designate some authority who can speak for the trees of the city that a resident could turn to and would actually be able to tell the road guys, hey, stop that. Next thing, I'd like the idea, it's in here, so if you can make sure it does get in the full cycle stewardship. You know, I was an guy, I'm an engineer, so I design. And when we talk about infrastructure, we talk about life cycle, which means maintenance, eventual replacement, removal, and those are, you need to just plan in for all those things. So I think I like this. I was really happy to see that. So I want to just give you a thumbs up and say, make sure that does get in there, because I think that's real. Think of your trees as part of the city's infrastructure, just structure. The equity part was really good. I think, actually, I'll get to that in a second. The themes in the beginning, I think it left me a little wonky. They're okay, but there's so much about process. They're always a process. It's like the process is more important than the thing. I think a lot of times planners feel that, and as an engineer, the thing, trees being planted or protected, is what's important. So, having said that, is there some way to, and you talked about accountability, but how are you going to measure performance? Are there metrics that you can build in so that you can go back and look and say, oh, this ordinance actually is working, not because we did this great process, but because we're actually protecting trees, or we're replanting trees? Is there some way to build in a metric that shows that this is having the real benefit that we want, which is on the ground, not just talking to people about it? That's all well and good, but it's like process is this and actually having trees is this. And I kind of feel like it's almost flip-flop in those themes in terms of.
Well, again, I'll turn it over to Jacket for the detailed answer. Dan, you never let me down. Dan and I run the planning commission together.
I got one more.
Okay, good.
Okay.
Well, can I answer that one before I forget?
Yes, you may.
Just because I think you're right, and I think the reason that so much process is referred to in the themes is because the public input group was charged not with writing the ordinance, but with giving the guiding structures for how the ordinance should be written. So they really were talking about kind of a process of creating the ordinance and the processes that the ordinance would then require. The ordinance itself, which is now being drafted, and again, we'll be sharing that as soon as it's ready. As you heard Jacket say, we have a lot of it so far, but it's not quite ready for distribution. That will be where obviously we will have the here are the rules of how this is engineered. So I just wanted to,
Cool.
and then the question about metrics and evaluation, has that come up at all?
Oh gosh, yeah.
Okay.
So, and I have this question also into parks. St. Paul has, I'm trying to remember what the specific language is like our urban tree study that hasn't been updated in a while. So my ask was on behalf of the group was just getting that up to date so that we have that as our starting metric. So we know how what our baseline is starting off from this, from implementing this ordinance, and then because how this is implemented will at the end of the day come down to standard operating procedures of how forestry and public works interacts with one another. We plan to write into the ordinance checkpoints. So the one that was suggested last night was 18 months out from when the ordinance takes effect, having a formal audit that comes to council that talks about projects and kind of does a post-mortem of how did this tree preservation ordinance play out on this project, on its construction season, on these, sidewalk panel replacements, to make sure that it's actually doing what we said it would, and using the updated urban tree study as a baseline data point.
Cool, good. I think that's a great idea. Having that inventory with you, a snapshot baseline is excellent. Maybe periodically, it's cost money, I mean, have a tree census, just keep looking at it. And in the interim, it's pretty straightforward, and just like it's satellite, Google Earth, satellite imagery will give you an idea how you're doing as well. So that's a thought. And then my last one, then I'll be done. Equity, huge. I'm glad to see that in there, and we do need to emphasize historically under canopied areas, and it's important. Those occur, I know, in areas that were underserved populations, African American, immigrants, poor people, and the more affluent were the ones who got all the trees. And so, look, you just have to look on a Google Earth and you can see there's lots of trees in Como, lots of trees in Highland Park, not so many trees in certain of these other areas. And that's very purposeful. That was the policy back in the past, and that's what we're needing to overcome. Though always keep a lens of, underserved populations move. So, so factor in under canopy, but also think about, but who's living there now? So under canopy plus underserved population. Priority one. So think of both of those. And having said that, under the creative ideas, there was one thing that it made me a little nervous when you talked about tax credits or incentives for residents with the capacity to contribute. And I worry that that could lead to greater inequity, by, incentivizing people who already can, because they have the ability to do that, which means they have the time, whatever, the resources, maybe an idea. So having said that, it's not that you don't want to incentivize, but what about some sort of like buy one, give one approach? In other words, they do something. They don't just do a tree, not just put a tree here in Mac Groveland, but also then correspondingly use their money to put a tree in whatever.
Interesting.
Or the North End. We'd love to see more in the North End too. So that's just a thought. That just came to me. That's why I want to give one gimmick. But anyway, this is great. I'm glad to see you doing it. Thanks.
And your point about the who lives there actually came up on Tuesday. So one of our updated pieces. So again, this is August, and this is like a important snapshot. But if I were to incorporate even from our last couple meetings we've had in the fall, the ask, literally this is fresh language from Tuesday, was ask for consideration of climate justice, resilience, and equity policies for neighborhood prioritization, including tree watering and maintenance support in areas with high rental populations or low urban tree canopy. So we already took that into consideration of just like, as you become a homeowner, you very quickly realize all the things that you are responsible for. And even though that tree is public property, you become really invested into it because you end up falling in love with that tree. It feels like part of your home, even though it's technically on the public right of way. But you don't always get that feeling when you're in a rental or you're a renter. You're just kind of like, it's just, you don't have that much connection. So we did talk about that of in areas that have higher levels of rental, it's not even just going to be about like replanting the tree, but it's going to be about that maintenance, whether that comes from the city, that comes from the district councils, that comes from block captain. So we literally just talked about that. And then just to add a little more context to the incentive, that was just in the creative ideas section. And our idea was that if someone with the means, even if, one, I don't think that we have the money, but if we did have the money to incentivize it, you getting that $100 credit to plant your tree would then remove a tree from the bottom. So the idea is that if here's our big tree planting list for the city of St. Paul, folks with the means are able to take from the top, get their tree in. That means that we've just loosened up funds to get the ones from the bottom moved out. So that was the idea of just we could just get through that tree list quicker.
Right, as long as it is paired with that, and after that, we'll do this. That's great, good.
Because then now less, if a tree is $500, let's say, and this cost to the city to plant that tree is now only $100 because the homeowner is picking up $400 of it, and they're just providing that $100 incentive to put your $400 into it. That means we now have $400 to go plant trees at the bottom of the list. That was the thinking.
Okay, we have one kind of timing question in the chat. So we'll get to that. I do have a question though too. So why don't we go ahead and go to the timing one and see if we have room for one more.
Yeah, and we've got Judy's question or comment here too. So thank you for that, Judy. We've noted that. I don't know when the Wheelock Grotto project is going to begin. Do you guys know? I should know.
I think that's next year.
Yeah, it's like April, I believe, the phase 2 and the continuation of phase 1 that got delayed.
Okay. We want this to be in effect by June 30th. And I don't, okay,
Yeah.
you can go ahead.
Oh,
We've got an email about exactly this. Okay.
yeah, because you have a great leadership at Como, and they prepped us in terms of coming with specifics to speak to your equivalent of Summit. And there's one for every neighborhood. So they said that talking with city staff, that they luckily said that phase 2 of this project shouldn't be as contentious as phase 1 because most of the streets already have sidewalks, and that was a really big sticking point of sidewalks versus trees. And that's something that, you know, we're trying to figure out with this ordinance. So at least from what we've been told by city staff is that it shouldn't be so much as a sidewalks versus trees discussion for phase 2, since a lot of your streets where they would be affected already have their sidewalks.
Thank you. Go ahead. There was, I think, Jessica, you had one in the
Well,
regular
I think
room
there's
there?
a lot now in this room.
Yeah.
Okay, well, my question was, I'm reading through this. So I was the organizer over at St. Anthony Park when Cleveland was happening. So this was a big conversation for us. And so one of my questions is, what is the current way that people know what's going on? I'm seeing a lot of like great things here, and I know in St. Anthony we talked a lot about, and in Como, the recent one here, we talked a lot about, you know, people waking up to red lines on their trees. But obviously there's a way that it's communicated now. What is that? And I guess what is that currently? Like, how do people know when this stuff is happening?
I've seen it only done informally. So, you know, the council member, like sometimes will get a heads up, this is happening. Trees are going to be impacted in this area on these dates, spread the word. Maybe they send an email to the district council, maybe not. And then, yeah, you see the red lines come up. I think
Okay, so
that's a
right now
huge
homeowners
gap.
are not like told, or residents or people living in the area aren't told this is happening. It truly is you wake up and there are red lines on trees. Unless you
That's
have,
my understanding. I know they do put
Okay.
out information after you've had a tree removed, if you have the option to choose the tree that goes in afterwards, because they do give
Okay.
residents the option to choose like from a list of boulevard trees, but that's not the same thing as for notice.
Okay. Okay, that's interesting. I just assumed there was a system that maybe just didn't work, or only some people are getting it, but good to know. So
Well,
yeah,
and it's a great point about the inequity between construction and trees, right? Like you do get there, it's not a mailer necessarily, but like if you're signed up for electronic notification, you'll know when there's street reconstruction or something happening on your street. But not the same level of detail for trees.
okay.
And we've challenged Public Works. Our like goodwill challenge asked to them is I'm always really impressed just as a legislative aide if I can go on Public Works's website and the project website. It's like this piece of mail said this was sent on this date. Here's the PDF. Here's the timeline. Here's all the docs, both public facing and internal. Like it's all in one spot. We want that same thing done for trees.
Yeah.
And we also put in our notes that were but not just like the website, but also public notification strategies may include yard signs like QR codes, collaboration with district councils to maximize outreach and engagement, just really trying to get to folks early so that you don't just see the red ring, because you don't know, is that red ring because of a construction project? Is that red ring because of disease? Is that red ring because of sewer, utilities? Like there's sometimes heartbreaking context for why that red ring is there, where it is not in good shape. We had a tree on a street near me where I was really sad. And when I did go up to the forester and asked, and he explained it to me and he showed how the inside was rotting, I was like, oh, this is going to hit a car. This is going to hit a child. Like it was heartbreaking to see that tree go, but I understood more just that, but that was me on a walk. That was me being, you know, willing to ask a city staff person, which not everyone may be in that position. So we've just talked about how can we make our public works communications, the way that we do our construction, just as good for trees and
Okay.
follow that model.
I think we have 2 more questions in person, Shavik and Michelle. I was gonna say, you're gonna have to yell.
thanks for speaking today and sharing all this information.
It's
We definitely
really,
can't hear.
it's
Sorry.
really
Yeah.
hard to hear you.
I can put it in the chat too, if we, just go ahead, I'll chat it.
So my question, or one of my comments around kind of like the life cycle management for the trees. I guess I would say, you know, talking about, you know, who can manage and all of that, like, kind of caution me as thinking that, you know, perhaps neighborhoods where there are less means that people can't also take care of it. So there may be an opportunity to be coupled with financial piece of potentially with the trees, from the actual maintenance. And then my other thought was, I'm personally part of the Master Gardener program, and I wonder if you've looked at partnering with Master Gardener programs or like Master Naturalists and all of that in terms of, more of the maintenance of the trees after that becomes, you know, a challenge to find that.
We made out some of that, but I think we're going to be
Okay,
dependent
hold
on the
on, we're
notes.
gonna
Sorry.
get, we're gonna,
Unless other people in the Zoom did. Thank you for the question. Like just because.
Okay, I think it's in the chat now.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, we
No,
talked
that's
about
good.
education around watering of like people, like especially when the guidance is you take your hose, you run your hose across, and then you let it like do a drip run. And as anyone who's been, you know, raised with parents are like, don't leave the faucet on. Like you might think that there's actually like a pretty large economic impact to letting your water run to water that tree. So we talked about some of this work just being around education, that it actually is only a few cents on the dollar to water your tree properly on a tree watering schedule. So we did talk about that. I know that I brought it up of like we have like volunteer opportunities through like parks. We talked about how can folks who maybe don't have financial means but have like the time and passion to do get trained in tree trimming and tree stewardship. We've also, not to put another thing on district councils, but we also talked about district councils at the end of the day are both looking for ways to care for their community and bring folks together. So could that also be something that we lean into more with? Obviously you don't mandate something without resourcing it. As much we love our district councils, we got to then make sure that we support that. So we did talk about the management, because one of the municipality we talked to was Mendota Heights. Mendota Heights doesn't have a lot of boulevards. Their tree preservation ordinance came into play with development happening on private properties. And what they did is, if a developer removed a tree, then a tree would have to be replaced on Mendota Heights public property. But what they wish that they put it in the ordinance is, once you hit that threshold of like you've hit your tree threshold, if you're planting anymore, you're compromising the nutrients, the shade, the care of the trees, they become jump trees, that you need a maintenance fund. You need to care for those trees who maybe are in less precarious areas. You need support for the water. So we've also been thinking about the maintenance piece as well.
Thank you so much for the questions. And we're noting the Master Gardener's idea. Everything we've got in the chat, we're also just noting down in our list, which is why it's so helpful to do this in advance. Like the feedback that you're asking about, if we haven't thought of it, now you have. So we've got it. So thank you. Was there one last question in the room?
I was just curious if for every tree that gets cut down needs to be replaced, if not in place somewhere else, is there any geographic restriction on that or being considered? And my thought, forgive me, Como, but goes to my history being downtown also, and the Wabasha trees, like they cut down 10 trees in Wabasha only to replace them in a grove of trees in Como. Like that doesn't do anything for downtown, which is severely lacking trees.
Right.
When I was downtown during COVID, I actually made a Google map of all, when you walk around downtown, there's holes where trees used to be in the sidewalk. And there's hundreds.
Tree holes.
Yeah, holes without trees. And I suspect if I did that same Google map over again today, after all of the street construction downtown, I bet most of those, or many of those holes have been covered up with just sidewalk, and those trees are never going to be replanted. And I worry about downtown street canopy. I really would advocate for not letting all the downtown trees migrate somewhere else in the city and hold the public works director to finding a place downtown to restore that canopy.
Yeah. No, I hear you. And I think that's exactly what we're trying to do. Sort of to your point and Dan's point, the idea is if they can't stay where they are, replant them in a place that prioritizes equity, and equity means both, where we don't have an urban tree canopy now. So that could be somewhere else in downtown where we don't have enough trees. I completely agree. Or it could be a place where folks have historically been disinvested in, where they may have trees now, but that we're trying to get to an equity related to population, not just trees. So I think the question that, again, the ordinance and the standard operating procedures needs to answer is, how do you decide where that place is in any given context? What takes priority? The lack of trees or the demographics of the people? And frankly, like big picture, what's our goal for tree canopy throughout the city? How many trees do we want to have in every area before we, or per person, per land area, mile, whatever the measurement is, so that we can say, we're good here, right? Right now, we know where we're not good, but we don't know this is where we need to make sure, we need to not replant here because it's a grove, because we're fine. We need to go somewhere else.
All right, folks, we are rounding on 8 o'clock here, and I think that what this really highlights is how much we care about our trees. So I'll ask if there are any last questions here.
It seems to me that this is going to cost. I'm happy that we've come to this point in the 21st century that we're thinking of trees as public infrastructure finally, and willing to codify that into law. A big concern I have is just in terms of valuing the trees in a practical sense, so that then people who lose their trees are compensated for the loss. Because I gotta believe that if you live in a place where there's all these wonderful massive trees, that block is decimated. In terms of the real estate value loss, I could imagine that's huge. And I think that some more practical valuations really need to be part of this whole thing. Because another thing that I think needs to happen is, I would suggest, you remove a big majestic tree, you don't plant a tree this big around and say that tree's replaced. That just doesn't work.
Right.
That happens to me. I've got tons of trees in my area, in my yard. That oak that's 60 years old, it's gonna go, we're gonna give you this. I'll be dead before that thing is even, 3 inches around. And I think this, if it's on city property, I think that there's gotta have to be some expense built in where the city maintains those trees. They plant bigger trees, which of course is gonna cost more. But then they're gonna make sure that those trees are watered and maintained on a regular basis. And it's great if individual owners are willing to step in and do some of that. But I don't think the onus should be on the people who have, whose frontage it is, to be the ones that have to maintain those trees.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. And you're pointing out a very important part of all of this, which is money. And the public input group has been clear from the beginning. We don't want, as Jack had said, to pass an unfunded mandate. So we have to think very carefully about what is the fiscal burden of both keeping the trees we have, replanting them, or keeping them maintained over time, as you're pointing out. I think the question of reimbursing property owners for trees that are lost on their property and affecting their property values gets into some pretty murky legal terrain pretty quickly in terms of what's the city's responsibility if, your street gets potholed and your property value goes down, to be compensated for that. Not to say that we can't look into it, but I think that gets into more complexity. What I'd like to do is pass an ordinance that's as robust as we can to try to protect the trees. And then a lot of these issues that are coming up that are adjacent to, but maybe beyond the scope of this first crack at it, that's why we can change ordinances. So I don't want to let the perfect be the enemy of the good and, get bogged down in legalities now. But your point is really well taken. And that's, again, the value of getting all of this feedback now is it also helps us see like, what can we bite off in this first go? And what do we need to come back to?
All right. Well, thank you, folks. Como loves their trees, like so many other places in the city. And I think I really appreciate highlighting that like every neighborhood has their clutch of trees that if you come for, somebody is going to be chaining themselves. Maybe it's Christy chaining themselves to the trees here. And so I think we all really appreciate, you know, we've had several of these community meetings over the last couple of years, specifically to talk about, you know, clearing Nebraska of all the ash borer trees and then having it be empty for 2 years, you know, all the way to losing some of the ones with the Wheelock Grotto project recently. It's a perennial issue that this board tends to see, and seeing action at the city council level really speaks to like the way that we see our community members elevating this on a pretty regular basis.
Well, right back at you. Thank you so much for giving us, being
Yeah.
so generous with your time. And, you know, again, huge shout out to Jekka, who, as you can see, is the expert on all of this, and has just been doing a ton of work. We're not going anywhere. Well, we're going somewhere now. We're not going to later. But please continue to share your feedback, and we'll stay in touch.
Well, thank you both. We appreciate it. And this is a perfect segue into our Environment Committee business.